Under the weight of my wicked secret, I pondered whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man if I divulged to that establishment. I conceived the idea that the time when the banns were read and when the clergyman said, "You are now to declare it," would be the time for me to rise and propose a private conference in the vestry. I am far from being sure that I might not have astonished our small congregation by resorting to this extreme measure, but for its being Christmas Day and no Sunday. Mr. Wopsle, the clerk at church, was to dine with us, and Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble, and Uncle Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, but Mrs. Joe appropriated him, who was a well-to-do corn chandler in the nearest town and drove his own chaise cart. The dinner hour was 1:30. When Joe and I got home, we found the table laid and Mrs. Joe dressed and the dinner dressing, and the front door unlocked. It never was at any other time for the company to enter by, and everything most splendid, and still not a word of the robbery. The time came without bringing with it any relief to my feelings, and the company came. Mr. Wopsle, united to a Roman nose and a large, shining, bald forehead, had a deep voice which he was uncommonly proud of. Indeed, it was understood among the acquaintance that if you could only give him his head, he would read the clergyman into fits. Indeed, it was understood among his acquaintance that if you could only give him his head, he would read the clergyman into fits. He himself confessed that if the church was thrown open, meaning to competition, he would not despair of making his mark in it. The church not being thrown open, he was, as I have said, our church clerk. But he punished the amens tremendously. And when he gave out the psalm, always giving the whole verse, he looked all around the congregation first, as much as to say, "You have heard my friend overhead. Oblige me with your opinion of this style." I opened the door to the company, making believe that it was a habit of ours to open that door, and I opened it first to Mr. Wopsle, next to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all to Uncle Pumblechook. N.B. I was not allowed to call him uncle, under the severest of penalties. "Mrs. Joe," said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man, with a mouth like a fish, dull staring eyes, and sandy hair standing straight upright on his head, so that he looked as if he had just been all but choked, and had that moment come to. "I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine. And I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine." Every Christmas Day he presented himself as a profound novelty, with exactly the same words, and carrying the two bottles like dumbbells. Every Christmas Day, Mrs. Joe replied, as she now replied, "Oh, Uncle Pumblechook, this is kind." Every Christmas Day he retorted, as he now retorted, "It's no more than your merits. And now you are all bobbish, and how's sixpenn'orth of halfpence? And now you are all bobbish, and how's sixpenn'orth of halfpence?" Meaning me. We dined on these occasions in the kitchen, and adjourned, for the nuts and oranges and apples, to the parlour, which was a change very like Joe's change from his working clothes to his Sunday dress. My sister was uncommonly lively on the present occasion, and indeed was generally more gracious in the society of Mrs. Hubble than in any other company. I remember Mrs. Hubble as a little, curly, sharp-edged person in sky blue, who held a conventionally juvenile position because she had married Mr. Hubble. I don't know at what remote period, when she was much younger than he. I remember Mr. Hubble as a tough, high-shouldered, stooping old man of a sawdusty fragrance, with his legs extraordinarily wide apart, so that in my short days I always saw some miles of open country between them when I met him coming up the lane. Among this good company, I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry, in a false position, not because I was squeezed in at an acute angle of the tablecloth, with the table in my chest and the Pumblechook elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak, I didn't want to speak, nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowl, and with those obscure corners of pork of which the pig, when living, had the least reason to be vain.